Hi there. Tonight we're stepping back in time, not to a grand ballroom or a bustling marketplace, but into the dimly lit, hushed chambers where medieval royal families plotted their futures. You're about to peek behind the velvet curtains of power, prestige, and profoundly questionable genetic decisions. Imagine the tapestries on the walls, perhaps a bit musty, the scent of beeswax candles, and the heavy weight of a crown passed down through generations who often shared a little too much. DNA, you might think you're safe, tucked in your bed, but trust me, after tonight, you'll be profoundly grateful you didn't have to marry your second cousin for geopolitical stability. You probably wouldn't survive this family tree. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're plunging headfirst into the often unsettling reality of medieval royal inbreeding, a practice that, while strategic, led to some truly grim consequences for those who sat on Europe's thrones. You see, back then, the concept of genetics, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. There were no double helixes, no Punnett squares, just a deep-seated belief in bloodlines and the consolidation of power. You're talking about a world where the idea of blue blood wasn't just a metaphor. It was a perceived, tangible reality that supposedly set royalty apart. You might envision medieval castles as romantic havens, but often they were more like gilded cages, especially when it came to marriage. Royal unions were rarely about love or personal choice. Instead, they were meticulous political maneuvers designed to forge alliances, secure territories, and, most crucially, keep wealth and influence locked firmly within the family. And what better way to ensure everything stayed in the family than to marry, well, within the family? It sounds simple enough on paper, a neat way to tie up loose ends and strengthen bonds, but it was a gamble with incredibly high stakes, played out over generations of unsuspecting heirs. This wasn't just a quirky habit of one or two eccentric monarchs. It was a widespread, deeply ingrained practice across almost all European royal houses for centuries, from the Plantagenets in England to the Valois in France, and particularly, notoriously, the Habsburgs, who dominated Central Europe and Spain. The concept of consanguineous marriage between close relatives, was shockingly common. Historians still argue whether the immediate benefits of these unions truly outweighed the long-term, devastating genetic costs. It was a dark truth whispered behind closed doors, often ignored until the physical and mental tolls became too obvious to deny. You're standing now in the grand hall of a medieval castle, the air thick with the scent of ambition and old stone. The reason for these unsettling matrimonial choices becomes immediately clear when you consider the political landscape of the time. Think of it like a medieval version of Monopoly, but with actual kingdoms at stake instead of Park Place. Consolidating power was the name of the game, and marriage was the ultimate strategic move. Marrying off a son or daughter wasn't just about finding a spouse. It was about forging unbreakable alliances, merging territories, and ensuring a stable, controllable future for the dynasty. Imagine your family holding vast lands, perhaps a rich duchy or a coveted kingdom. You want to make sure that wealth, those titles, and that control over resources don't slip through your fingers like sand. The most straightforward solution: keep it all in the family. By marrying a first cousin, an aunt, or even, in some truly head-scratching cases, an uncle, you effectively doubled down on your existing assets. It was like putting all your eggs in one very elaborately decorated, slightly rickety basket. This wasn't about love. It was about lineage and leveraging every possible connection to secure a firmer grip on the throne. The rationale was simple: fewer outside claimants, fewer pesky rivalries, and a supposedly stronger, more unified front against any external threats. If your son married your brother's daughter, for instance, any children they had would be undeniably part of your immediate lineage, inheriting lands and titles that would otherwise be split or contested by a more distant branch. It was a perfectly logical, if profoundly misguided, approach to estate planning on a grand scale. You wouldn't invite a stranger to be the CEO of your family business, would you? Medieval monarchs felt much the same about their kingdoms. This practice also helped to maintain a certain brand identity for royal families. Each dynasty had its symbols, its traditions, and its particular claims to legitimacy, often tracing back to some legendary founder or even divine right. Marrying within the established bloodline was seen as preserving this unique dynastic identity, preventing it from being diluted by common or foreign blood. It was an exclusive club, and the membership requirements were very, very strict. Historians still argue whether this focus on dynastic purity was a primary driver or merely a convenient justification for the more pragmatic goal of power consolidation. You can almost hear the advisors whispering in the background, drawing up intricate family trees, not to celebrate family reunions, but to identify the next ideal, genetically proximate spouse. The goal was to weave an ever tighter web of familial connections, making it almost impossible for anyone outside that specific, incestuous circle to lay a legitimate claim to power. It was a strategy born of a deep-seated fear of losing control, a fear that, ironically, often led to their eventual downfall. So, you've grasped the political machinations, the grand chess game of kingdoms and alliances. But underlying all that strategic maneuvering was an even more profound, albeit scientifically flawed, belief: the concept of pure bloodlines. Imagine sitting in a medieval court, listening to pronouncements about the divine right of kings, and you'll quickly understand that lineage wasn't just important, it was sacred. There was a prevailing, almost mystical, conviction that royal blood was intrinsically different, inherently superior, and that this purity needed to be meticulously preserved, almost like a rare vintage wine. You see, the idea was that if a royal married someone below their station or from a lesser family, it would somehow taint this precious, supposedly pure blood. It wasn't just about losing power or land, it was about diluting the very essence of what made them royal. This belief, of course, is a complete misconception from a genetic standpoint. Blood is blood, and while certain traits are inherited, there's no such thing as purer blood in a biological sense. But try telling that to a medieval monarch convinced of their divine right. They lived in a world where noble ancestry was a literal mark of distinction, a sign of God's favor. This obsession with purity often led to highly restrictive marriage pools. If you were a king or queen, your potential spouses weren't just anyone from a neighboring kingdom. They had to be of equally exalted, and preferably related, lineage. It was like trying to find a needle in a haystack, except the haystack was made of other very exclusive, slightly inbred needles. This meant that the pool of eligible partners often shrank to a handful of closely related individuals, making the choice almost inevitable. Oh, you mean my second cousin once removed, with the slightly wonky eye and questionable temperament, is the only suitable match? Marvelous. This wasn't just about preserving property. It was about preserving an identity, a perceived genetic superiority that set them apart from the common rabble. They genuinely believed that qualities like courage, intelligence, and leadership were passed down solely through these tightly controlled bloodlines. If you introduced too much outsider blood, you risked introducing undesirable traits, like, heaven forbid, common sense or a penchant for knitting instead of conquering. Historians still argue whether this ideological drive for purity was a genuine, deeply held conviction, or simply a convenient excuse to justify the pragmatic power grabs that inbreeding enabled. So, while we today understand that diversity in a gene pool is actually a strength, providing resilience against disease and promoting healthy variation, medieval royals operated under the opposite assumption. They were, in essence, trying to distill their royal essence into an ever more concentrated form, unaware that they were simply concentrating the risk of unforeseen genetic consequences. It was a colossal blind spot, a dangerous gamble based on superstition rather than science, and it set the stage for generations of royal suffering. You've seen the political and ideological motivations behind royal inbreeding. Now prepare yourself for the truly dark truth, the one that makes your genetically diverse ancestors heave a sigh of relief. While medieval monarchs were busy consolidating power and preserving their pure bloodlines, they were, unknowingly, playing a dangerous game of genetic roulette. This wasn't a game show you'd ever want to win. The fundamental problem, which science wouldn't explain for centuries, lies in something called recessive genetic disorders. Think of your genes like a deck of cards. You get 2 copies of every card, one from each parent. For many traits, if you have 1 good card and 1 bad card carrying a disorder, the good card usually wins, and you don't show the disorder. You become a carrier. Now, here's where inbreeding turns into a horror story. When close relatives marry, they share a significant portion of their genetic deck. This dramatically increases the odds that both parents will carry the same bad card. Suddenly, those hidden, recessive genes have a much higher chance of pairing up in their offspring. If a child inherits 2 copies of that bad card, one from each parent, boom, the disorder manifests. It's like flipping a coin, but the coin is rigged and the stakes are human lives. While a rare recessive disorder might have a tiny chance of appearing in the general population, within an inbred royal family, the chance skyrockets. It's not just a little bit higher. We're talking about a potential exponential increase. Imagine a tiny, almost invisible flaw in a beautiful tapestry. If you keep weaving with threads from the same spool that has that flaw, eventually the flaw becomes glaringly obvious throughout the entire fabric. That's essentially what happened with royal gene pools. Each generation of inbreeding narrowed the genetic diversity further, creating what geneticists call a bottleneck effect. The gene pool became so shallow that harmful recessive alleles, which would normally remain hidden or diluted in a larger population, had nowhere to go but into the next generation. This wasn't always immediately apparent, which made it even more insidious. A child might be born seemingly healthy, only for symptoms to emerge later in life, or for their own children to suffer more severely. It was a ticking genetic time bomb, patiently waiting to express itself. Historians still argue whether the widespread knowledge of specific physical deformities or mental incapacities among European royalty contributed to a nascent, albeit unscientific, understanding of these risks even before genetics was a field of study. Regardless, the dice were rolled, and often the outcome was devastating. Now, let's put a face, or rather, a jaw, to this genetic roulette, the infamous Habsburg jaw. You've likely seen portraits of Habsburg rulers, and if you have, you probably noticed a recurring, rather striking facial feature, a pronounced, often jutting lower jaw, sometimes accompanied by a thick lower lip and a drooping nose. It's the kind of feature that makes you do a double take, wondering if the artist was just having a bad day, or if there was something more going on. Well, there was a lot more. The Habsburg dynasty was, without a doubt, the undisputed champion of royal inbreeding. For centuries, they married their cousins, their nieces, and even closer relatives with a dedication that would make a genealogist weep. Their family tree eventually looked less like a tree and more like a very tightly wound, tangled ball of yarn. You see, the Habsburgs were incredibly successful at consolidating power, ruling vast swaths of Europe, from Spain to Austria and beyond. But their insatiable quest for dynastic control came at a profound genetic cost. The prognathism, as that jutting jaw is technically called, became a hallmark of the family. It wasn't just a quirky family resemblance. It was a physical manifestation of generations of reduced genetic diversity. While some degree of prognathism can be present in any population, its extreme and widespread appearance throughout the Habsburg line, coupled with other associated facial anomalies, points directly to inbreeding as the primary exacerbating factor. It was a genetic signature, written on their very faces. Imagine trying to deliver a rousing speech to your troops or charm a visiting ambassador. When your jaw is so prominent it hinders clear speech, or perhaps having difficulty closing your mouth fully, leading to dental issues and a somewhat perpetually bewildered expression. These weren't just cosmetic concerns. They could impact a ruler's perceived competence and charisma, not to mention their personal comfort and health. It's hard to look majestic when you're constantly drooling a little, but the Habsburg jaw was often just one piece of a larger, more tragic puzzle. Many Habsburgs suffered from a host of other debilitating conditions, often overlooked in historical texts, that focused more on battles and treaties. These included everything from intellectual disabilities to chronic illnesses and a general frailty. While historians still argue whether all the Habsburgs' misfortunes can be directly attributed to inbreeding, the overwhelming consensus points to it as a major contributing factor to their distinctive physical traits and overall health challenges. It was a stark visual reminder of the dark side of dynastic ambition. Beyond the distinctive Habsburg jaw, another chilling example of inbreeding's genetic toll is the spread of hemophilia, often dubbed the royal disease. This wasn't confined to a single dynasty like the Habsburgs. It became a grim, invisible thread weaving through several prominent European royal families, all linked by intermarriage. You see, hemophilia is a blood clotting disorder, meaning even a small cut can lead to severe, uncontrollable bleeding, and internal bleeding can be life-threatening. It's a truly terrifying condition to live with, especially in an era before modern medical interventions. The story of royal hemophilia famously begins with Queen Victoria of England, who, ironically, was not a product of close inbreeding herself. She was a carrier of the gene, meaning she didn't suffer from the disease, but could pass it on to her children. And pass it on she did, with devastating efficiency. Because of the vast network of arranged marriages among Europe's royal houses, her descendants ended up on thrones across the continent, taking the hemophilia gene with them. It was like a very unwelcome wedding gift. The that just kept on giving. Imagine the anxiety of these royal parents. You're producing an heir, the future of your dynasty, and there's this constant, terrifying fear that they might inherit a debilitating illness that could kill them from a simple playground tumble. Victoria's son, Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany, suffered from hemophilia and died at a relatively young age. But it was her granddaughters who truly became tragic figures in this genetic drama. Two of her granddaughters, Princess Irene of Hesse and Bahrain, and Princess Alix of Hesse and Bahrain, who later became Empress Alexandra Feodorovna of Russia, were carriers, and through them the disease spread to the Spanish and Russian royal families. The most famous case, perhaps, is that of Tsarevich Alexei Romanov, the only son and heir of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. Alexei's hemophilia was a closely guarded state secret, his life a constant dance with danger. Any bruise or cut could turn fatal, leading his desperate parents to rely on figures like Rasputin, who claimed to have healing powers. This private struggle had immense public and political repercussions, contributing to the instability that ultimately toppled the Romanov dynasty. It's hard to rule an empire when your only son is constantly on the brink of death. While historians still argue about the precise genetic origins and the full extent of its impact on the political landscape, there's no denying that hemophilia became a silent, deadly enemy within the royal palaces. It highlighted the profound vulnerability that even the most powerful families faced when playing genetic roulette, a hidden curse that emerged from the very desire to concentrate power and pure blood. It was a dark, ironic twist of fate, a brutal reminder that nature, eventually, always bats last. You've seen how inbreeding could bring debilitating diseases into the royal nurseries. Now, let's talk about something equally fundamental to a dynasty's survival: fertility. Because what's the point of consolidating power and preserving a pure bloodline if that bloodline eventually runs dry? Inbred populations and medieval royal families were no exception, often experienced significantly lower fertility rates. It's like trying to get a rare orchid to bloom when you keep planting it in the same exhausted soil. Eventually, it just stops producing. Imagine the immense pressure on a royal couple, especially the queen, to produce heirs. The primary purpose of a royal marriage wasn't companionship or affection. It was procreation. Failure to produce a healthy son, particularly, could lead to immense political instability, whispers of divorce, or even outright dynastic crisis. And when generations of close-skin marriages had already narrowed the genetic pool, the biological odds of successful conception and live births plummeted. This wasn't just about the inability to conceive. It was also about an increased risk of miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant mortality. You can picture the heartbreak in the royal chambers, joy turning to despair as another pregnancy ended tragically, or a newborn, frail from birth, failed to thrive. These losses weren't just personal tragedies. They were public failures, threatening the very continuation of the ruling house. Each failed pregnancy or lost infant was a stark reminder of the hidden price of their carefully constructed family trees. The accumulation of harmful recessive genes, which we discussed earlier, didn't just cause specific disorders. It could also lead to a general reduction in overall genetic fitness. This meant that even if a child was born without a clearly identifiable genetic illness, they might be weaker, less robust, and simply less capable of reproducing successfully themselves. It's a cruel irony. The very mechanism designed to secure a dynasty's future often contained the seeds of its destruction. Historians still argue about the precise demographic impact of royal inbreeding on fertility across Europe, as detailed birth records were often patchy or incomplete. However, the anecdotal evidence is compelling. Time and again, you find royal lines struggling to produce heirs, or producing heirs who were too sickly to rule or reproduce themselves. This often forced them to look for more distant relations, or even completely new dynasties, to fill the void, thereby undermining the very goal of pure bloodlines they had so desperately tried to maintain. It was a vicious cycle, ending in either barrenness or the desperate search for outside genetic material. And if reduced fertility wasn't enough to contend with, the other grim reality for inbred royal lines was a consistently shortened lifespan. You're not just talking about failing to produce heirs. You're talking about the heirs, once born, struggling to live long enough to fulfill their purpose. Imagine the pressure, not just to survive, but to survive and rule for a significant period. Picture a medieval court where the monarch, or their heir, is constantly battling ailments, from persistent coughs and fevers to more debilitating chronic conditions. While life expectancy was generally lower in the medieval period for everyone, inbred royals often faced an amplified struggle. Their compromised immune systems, coupled with a higher susceptibility to various genetic weaknesses, made them particularly vulnerable to the myriad of diseases that swept through Europe. It was like living with your body's check engine light perpetually illuminated. Think about the sheer number of childhood deaths in royal families. While infant mortality was high for all, the children of heavily inbred unions often faced even steeper odds. Many simply didn't make it to adulthood, or if they did, they were plagued by a host of health issues that severely limited their capacity to govern or enjoy life. It's not a stretch to say that for many inbred royals, every day was a fight for survival, a testament to their compromised genetic makeup. This isn't to say that all inbred royals were frail in ballads. Some, remarkably, defied the odds. But statistically, the trend was clear. The accumulation of harmful recessive genes, which manifested as specific disorders like hemophilia or a general decline in robust health, often meant that their bodies simply weren't built for longevity. It was a slow, inexorable decline, sometimes playing out over generations, sometimes striking down an individual in the prime of their supposed life. You might inherit a throne, but you also inherited a biological ticking clock. Historians still argue about the exact statistical impact of inbreeding on royal lifespans versus other factors like diet, sanitation, and exposure to endemic diseases. However, the recurring patterns of early deaths, chronic illness, and general frailty within specific, heavily inbred dynasties strongly suggest a significant correlation. It was a profound irony that in their desperate attempt to secure eternal power through bloodlines, they often condemned their own descendants to a shortened existence, a brief flicker of life on the throne before illness claimed them. It was a bleak outlook, especially when the future of an entire kingdom rested on such fragile shoulders. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most poignant and stark examples of inbreeding's devastating toll, Charles II of Spain. You've probably heard of him, and if you haven't, prepare for a truly tragic story. Charles II, the last Habsburg, King of Spain, was born in 1661, and his very existence was a walking, breathing testament to the dangers of generations of relentless inbreeding. His family tree was less a tree and more a tangled shrub, knotted by 9 successive generations of first cousin or uncle-niece marriages. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandmother was also his aunt. It gets confusing just thinking about it. Imagine a child born into immense privilege, yet cursed from birth. Charles was physically weak, plagued by a litany of health issues from infancy. He had an enormous, protruding Habsburg jaw that made it almost impossible for him to chew food effectively or speak clearly. He couldn't close his mouth, leaving him constantly drooling. His tongue was so large that it interfered with his speech, making him difficult to understand. This wasn't just a physical inconvenience. It deeply affected his ability to function. As a monarch, how do you inspire confidence in your subjects when you struggle to articulate a simple command? Beyond the physical deformities, Charles suffered from severe intellectual disabilities. He didn't learn to speak until he was 4 and couldn't walk until he was 8. Throughout his life, he remained mentally incompetent, described by contemporaries as sluggish, confused, and prone to illness. You can picture him, a frail, often bewildered figure, propped up on a throne, while the actual governance of Spain fell to his regents and ministers. It was a monarchy by proxy, a rule by committee, all because the king himself was barely capable of independent thought. The most critical consequence, however, was his inability to produce an heir. Charles II was married twice, first to Marie Louise of Orleans, and then to Maria Anna of Neuburg. Both marriages were meticulously planned attempts to secure the succession, but both were tragically fruitless. His impotence and general ill health meant that the direct line of the Spanish Habsburgs, so carefully guarded and intertwined through centuries of inbreeding, ultimately died with him. It was the ultimate, crushing irony. Historians still argue about the precise cause of Charles's myriad afflictions, but the overwhelming scientific consensus points directly to the severe inbreeding within his lineage. Recent genetic studies have even calculated his coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of shared ancestry, to be higher than that of a child born of an incestuous relationship between siblings. His life and death precipitated the War of the Spanish Succession, a continent-spanning conflict fought over who would inherit a throne left vacant by a monarch whose very existence was a genetic warning. It's a sobering thought. A man born to rule, yet genetically condemned to be the end of his line. The tragic saga of Charles II serves as a stark transition to one of the most chilling consequences of relentless inbreeding, dynastic extinction. You've seen how these families strove to consolidate power and ensure their lineage. But, ironically, the very methods they employed often led to their ultimate downfall. Imagine building an elaborate sandcastle, meticulously designed to withstand the tide, only to find that the sand itself is dissolving beneath your hands. That's what happened to many royal lines, when fertility rates plummeted, when heirs were born sickly and died young, or when, like Charles II, they were simply unable to procreate. The inevitable outcome was that the ruling family simply ran out of viable members. There was no one left to inherit the crown, no one to carry on the family name, and no one to continue the carefully cultivated pure bloodline. The throne, once so fiercely protected, became a vacant seat, a symbol of a gamble lost. Think of its centuries of strategic marriages, political maneuvering, and even wars, all aimed at securing a dynasty's future, undone by invisible genetic forces. It's not always a dramatic, sudden end. Sometimes it's a slow, agonizing fade, like a candle, flickering out after consuming its own wick. A line might produce a single, sickly heir for a few generations, each one weaker than the last, until finally there are no more children to succeed. This wasn't a rare anomaly. While the Habsburgs of Spain are the most famous example. Other royal houses across Europe faced similar plights. The struggle to produce a male heir became a recurring nightmare, and when only daughters survived, or when the entire generation was infertile, the dynasty faced an existential threat. It's a reminder that even immense power couldn't defy the basic laws of biology. You could conquer nations, but you couldn't conquer your own compromised genes. Historians still argue about the relative weight of inbreeding versus other factors like wars, assassinations, or political revolutions in the collapse of certain dynasties. However, the recurring pattern of a line simply failing to reproduce healthy, fertile heirs, especially after generations of close-kin marriage, provides compelling evidence. You might recall the Mongol women who served as regents when there wasn't a male ruler. This highlights how precarious a dynasty could be without a clear male heir, a problem often exacerbated by inbreeding. It was a silent, internal enemy, far more insidious than any invading army, gradually eroding the very foundation of royal power until, one day, there was simply nothing left. The lights went out, the banners were lowered, and a family that believed itself immortal vanished into the annals of history. The extinction of a dynasty wasn't just a matter of a family tree losing its last leaf. It almost invariably led to political instability. You've witnessed the fragility of a crown resting on the head of someone like Charles II. Now, imagine that crown, quite literally, with no head to rest upon. This created a power vacuum, and nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum, especially a geopolitical one. When a royal line, weakened by generations of inbreeding, finally succumbed to produced an heir too incompetent to rule, effectively it didn't just mean a quiet changing of the guard. Oh no, it meant a full-blown crisis. Suddenly, every ambitious duke, every neighboring king with a distant familial claim, and even local nobles who saw an opportunity, began to jostle for control. It was like a medieval mosh pit, but with armies and declarations of war instead of sweaty bodies. The most famous example, of course, is the War of the Spanish Succession, directly triggered by the death of Charles II without an heir. His frailty and barrenness, a direct result of Habsburg inbreeding, plunged Europe into over a decade of bloody conflict. You had the Bourbons of France, the Austrian Habsburgs, and various other European powers all laying claim to the vast Spanish empire, convinced they had the most legitimate right. Millions died, territories changed hands, and the balance of power across the continent was fundamentally reshaped. All because one family had too many shared genes. But it wasn't just large-scale wars. Succession crises could lead to internal strife, civil wars, and periods of severe governmental weakness. When the ruler was a child, or mentally incapacitated, power often devolved to regents, who then squabbled among themselves, creating factions and intrigue. Imagine the stability of a nation when its leadership is constantly in flux, when every decree could be challenged, and when foreign powers are circling like vultures. It's certainly not conducive to a good night's sleep for the populace. This inherent instability often undermined the very authority of the monarchy itself. If the king was perceived as weak, or if the line of succession was constantly in question, it eroded the divine right, the mystique that held society together. It presented opportunities for revolts, for regional powers to assert their independence, and for general chaos to reign. The focus on preserving pure bloodlines, intended to strengthen the monarchy, often had the perverse effect of making it incredibly vulnerable. It's a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest threats come not from outside the castle walls, but from within the very fabric of the family. You've seen the internal struggles caused by inbreeding. Now, let's zoom out and appreciate the truly intricate tapestry of power that was Europe's interconnected royal web. Imagine trying to untangle a ball of yarn after a particularly enthusiastic kitten has had its way with it. That's roughly what royal family trees looked like. For centuries, across the continent, royal families were less like independent entities and more like one enormous, highly dysfunctional, extended family. From the chilly fjords of Scandinavia to the sun-drenched plains of Spain, almost every ruling house in Europe was connected by blood. The English Tudors married into the Spanish Habsburgs, who were already intertwined with the Austrian Habsburgs, who themselves married into the French Bourbons, and so on. It was a dizzying array of cousins, second cousins, and very occasionally, uncle-niece pairings, all designed to cement alliances, secure peace, or at least less war, and consolidate power. You might find it hard enough to keep track of your own distant relatives at a family reunion. Imagine trying to manage the political ramifications of literally dozens of them across an entire continent. This wasn't just about finding a suitable spouse. It was about finding the most suitable spouse from a painstakingly vetted list of equally high-born and likely related individuals. A prince or princess might have several potential spouses, all of whom shared a common great-grandparent. It was an exclusive club, and the membership was almost entirely determined by who you were related to, not by whom you might actually, heaven forbid, like. This constant intermarriage created a sort of European royal gene pool, which, while initially intended to create strong bonds, ultimately ensured that any negative genetic traits were very efficiently shared around. It was like a giant, continent-spanning potluck, where everyone brought the same dish, and that dish was a recipe for disaster. This intricate web meant that a disease or genetic predisposition manifesting in one royal family could, within a generation or two, pop up hundreds or thousands of miles away in a seemingly unrelated kingdom. Remember how hemophilia spread from Queen Victoria's descendants to Russia and Spain. That's the interconnected royal web in action. A single carrier, marrying into multiple families, could unknowingly plant seeds of illness across an entire continent. The complex relationships often led to fascinating diplomatic dance. A peace treaty might be sealed by a marriage, only for that alliance to be tested generations later by a succession crisis in a distant land, fueled by the very blood ties that were supposed to guarantee stability. It's truly incredible how often the political fate of millions rested on the reproductive success or failure of a handful of individuals whose genetic makeup had been compromised by their ancestors' ambition. You've explored the visible, physical consequences of inbreeding, like the Habsburg jaw and the debilitating effects of hemophilia. But what about the less obvious, yet equally devastating, impacts? Let's delve into the mental toll that generations of inbreeding could inflict upon royal minds. It wasn't always about glaring physical deformities. Sometimes, the most profound damage was done within the very seat of their intellect and temperament. Imagine holding immense power, having the fate of nations in your hands, yet struggling with chronic cognitive impairment or unpredictable mood swings, or even outright mental illness. While diagnosing specific conditions from centuries ago is challenging without modern medical records, historical accounts are riddled with descriptions of royal figures exhibiting intellectual deficiencies, learning difficulties, eccentric behaviors, and even bouts of what sounds eerily like severe mental health crises. You can't just chalk it all up to the stressors of ruling. Consider, for a moment, the immense pressure on a monarch. They needed to be sharp, decisive, charismatic, and capable of navigating complex political landscapes. If a king or queen suffered from a genetic predisposition to low intelligence or severe psychological issues, it didn't just affect them personally, it directly impacted their ability to govern. Think of the chaotic decisions, the missed opportunities, the inability to grasp complex statecraft. It's like trying to pilot a supertanker with someone who keeps forgetting which way is forward. While we can't definitively state that every instance of perceived royal madness or idiocy was solely due to inbreeding, the prevalence of such accounts within heavily consanguineous lines suggests a strong correlation. The same recessive genes that could lead to physical ailments could also impact brain development and function, potentially predisposing individuals to cognitive impairments or neurological disorders. It was a silent, insidious erosion of the very intellectual capacity needed to rule effectively. For instance, beyond Charles II's well-documented physical and mental incapacities, numerous other royal figures throughout history displayed what contemporaries described as feeble-mindedness or significant developmental delays. These weren't always enough to prevent them from inheriting the throne, but they certainly hampered their reign, often leading to power struggles among ambitious regents or frustrated advisors. It's a subtle but crucial aspect of the inbreeding narrative. You might be able to hide a physical deformity under lavish robes, but it's far harder to disguise a mind that simply isn't equipped for the demands of kingship. Historians continue to debate the degree to which these mental and cognitive challenges were purely genetic versus the result of isolated, pampered upbringings or other environmental factors. However, the recurring pattern within these constrained gene pools offers a chilling perspective on the unseen, yet deeply impactful, consequences of familial ambition. You've delved into the grim genetic consequences. Now, let's explore a fascinating, often contradictory aspect of this whole saga: the Church's shifting stance on consanguineous marriages. You might assume that a religious institution would outright condemn such unions, especially given the clear biological ramifications. But the reality was far more nuanced and often surprisingly flexible. The early Christian Church generally frowned upon marriages between close relatives. This wasn't necessarily for genetic reasons. Those were largely unknown, but rather stemmed from moral, social, and spiritual concerns. Prohibitions on incest were deeply rooted in ancient laws, and the Church expanded these prohibitions to an astonishing degree. At one point, canon law could prohibit marriage even between individuals who shared a common ancestor 7 degrees removed, which is incredibly broad by modern standards. Imagine trying to find anyone not related to you 7 generations back. In a small medieval village, it was almost impossible. This strictness, however, created a unique power dynamic for the Church. By having such extensive prohibitions, they also held the power to grant dispensations, essentially an official waiver from the rules. And guess who often needed these waivers the most? You guessed it, the royals. For a king or queen desperate to marry a first cousin for political reasons, a papal dispensation was worth its weight in gold, or rather, in newly acquired territories and secured alliances. The Church's stance wasn't static. Over time, particularly as royal intermarriage became an ever more entrenched tool of statecraft, the prohibitions sometimes relaxed, or at least the readiness to grant dispensations increased. While the official line condemned incest, the practical needs of powerful monarchs often found a loophole, or at least a very convenient exception. Blessed by Rome, It was a fascinating balancing act between spiritual purity and political pragmatism. You might wonder if the Church had any inkling of the genetic dangers. While they lacked scientific understanding, they certainly observed the prevalence of certain conditions or weaknesses within closely related noble lines. Whether these observations directly influenced their theological stance or merely reinforced existing taboos is a matter scholars still debate. Did they see the Habsburg jaw and think, divine displeasure? Or perhaps we should be stricter with these dispensations? It's difficult to say with certainty. Ultimately, the Church's position on consanguineous marriage was less about clear-cut moral absolutes and more about a complex interplay of theology, social control, and political influence. It allowed for a convenient elasticity that, while outwardly maintaining a moral high ground, often facilitated the very practices that led to so much royal suffering. It's a classic example of rules being bent, if not broken, for the sake of power. You've seen the Church's shifting, often pragmatic, stance on consanguineous marriage. Now, let's talk about the ultimate loophole, dispensation. Imagine a medieval monarch, absolutely set on marrying their first cousin to secure a vital border region or merge to vast estates. The Church's strict rules on close-kin marriage loomed large, but for those with enough power, enough persuasion, and often enough gold, there was always a way. This way was a papal dispensation, essentially a special permission granted by the Pope himself, allowing a marriage that would otherwise be forbidden by canon law. Think of it as a divine get-out-of-jail-free card, specifically for marriage. These dispensations weren't handed out lightly, at least not in theory. They often required extensive petitions, justifications detailing the political or social necessity of the union, and, crucially, significant financial contributions to the papal state. It was a transactional relationship, where the spiritual authority of Rome could be leveraged for temporal gain, both for the Church and for the petitioning monarchs. For royal families, obtaining a dispensation was often a critical step in their marriage negotiations. Without it, their carefully constructed alliances could crumble. A king might argue that a marriage between his son and his niece was absolutely essential to prevent a devastating war or to unite two warring factions, thereby ensuring peace and stability. Convenient, isn't it? The Pope, in turn, could weigh these political arguments against the canonical prohibitions and decide whether the greater good, or perhaps a more substantial donation, justified bending the rules. This system of dispensation highlights the immense power wielded by the papacy in the medieval and early modern periods. They weren't just spiritual leaders. They were major political players, capable of influencing the destinies of entire kingdoms through their decisions on matters as personal as marriage. It was a fascinating, if somewhat cynical, dynamic. You might wonder if any pope ever looked at a heavily inbred royal family and thought, perhaps we should stop enabling this cycle of suffering. If they did, their concerns were often outweighed by the political expediency of maintaining good relations with powerful monarchs. The frequency with which these dispensations were sought and granted, especially for powerful royal families, underscores just how vital inbreeding was considered. For dynastic survival and power consolidation, it became almost a standard operating procedure for many royal unions. While the Church held the moral authority to forbid these unions, its willingness to provide a path around those prohibitions effectively sanctioned, and even enabled, the continued practice of close-kin marriage among Europe's elite. It was a testament to the idea that for those at the very top, rules were often more like polite suggestions, especially when divine permission could be bought or bartered for. You've seen how easily royal families could bypass the church's rules with a dispensation. Now let's consider a fascinating comparison: the double standard between commoners and royals. While you've focused on the kings and queens, it's crucial to understand that their practices were often starkly different from what was acceptable, or even possible, for the vast majority of the population. Imagine living in a small medieval village. Your world is much smaller, your marriage pool significantly limited by geography and social status. Marrying a distant cousin might have been somewhat common, simply because your local options were few, and you probably knew everyone in your village. But marrying a first cousin, or an uncle or niece, was far less prevalent and often viewed with suspicion, if not outright condemnation, by the community and local church authorities. Why? Because commoners didn't have a pope on speed dial to grant them a special marriage waiver. For the common folk, the social stigma associated with marrying too close was often a powerful deterrent. While they lacked a scientific understanding of genetics, they certainly observed patterns. They might notice that children from overly close unions sometimes seemed sickly, or perhaps had unusual features, leading to folk wisdom or superstitions about such pairings. They might not have used terms like recessive genes, but they certainly understood the concept of something just isn't right there. Moreover, commoners weren't playing the same game of geopolitical chess. Their marriages were about forming stable households, securing modest inheritances, and ensuring enough hands for the farm. There was no kingdom to consolidate, no vast fortune to keep pure. Their motivations were simpler, more grounded in survival and local community. For them, a healthy family was the goal, not a genetically compromised bloodline designed to hold onto power at any cost. You also learned that for Mongol women, marriage was arranged by both families, emphasizing communal stability rather than solely consolidating power within a single royal line. So, while kings and queens were routinely engaging in unions that would make modern geneticists gasp, the vast majority of their subjects were generally marrying outside such close familial bounds. It was a clear illustration of how power and ambition could override what might otherwise be considered common sense or social convention. The rules, it seemed, applied differently depending on how many crowns you owned or how much land your family controlled. This stark contrast raises questions that historians still debate. Did commoners possess an intuitive understanding of the risks that royals deliberately ignored? Or were their circumstances simply different enough that they didn't face the same pressures? Whatever the answer, it's clear that royal inbreeding wasn't a societal norm. It was a peculiar and often devastating practice born of extraordinary ambition and a unique set of circumstances that set them apart from literally everyone else. You've witnessed the medieval world's blind spots regarding genetics. Now, let's fast forward mentally to the future, to a time when what was once a mystery would become clear: the dawn of scientific awakening and the emergence of genetics. Imagine the absolute shock, and perhaps a touch of morbid fascination, with which future scientists would look back at these royal family trees. For centuries, kings and queens had unknowingly been conducting a vast, uncontrolled human experiment, and the results were right there in their portraits, their medical records, and their shortened, often tragic lives. The true understanding of why inbreeding was so detrimental wouldn't come until the 19th and 20th centuries, with the groundbreaking work of scientists like Gregor Mendel, an Augustinian friar, yes, a monk, conducted experiments with pea plants, painstakingly observing how traits were passed down through generations. His work, initially ignored, laid the foundation for modern genetics, explaining concepts like dominant and recessive genes and how they combine. It's a rather amusing thought. While royal families were busy breeding themselves into oblivion, a monk in a monastery was quietly unraveling the very biological laws they were breaking. With Mendel's rediscovery in the early 20th century, and the subsequent rapid advancements in genetics and molecular biology, the mechanisms behind the Habsburg jaw, hemophilia, and general royal frailty suddenly made perfect, devastating sense. Scientists could now explain precisely why close relatives had a higher chance of passing on harmful recessive traits, and how generations of inbreeding could concentrate those traits to such a destructive degree. It was like finally getting the instruction manual for a highly complex, broken machine. This scientific awakening completely dismantled the medieval concept of pure bloodlines. What they thought was purity was, in fact, an ever-increasing risk. The very act of trying to preserve an imagined genetic superiority was, from a scientific perspective, the quickest way to introduce genetic vulnerabilities. It highlighted the profound difference between a belief system based on tradition and divine rights, and one grounded in observable, verifiable biological facts. You can almost hear the collective gasp of future generations, looking back at these powerful monarchs, and realizing they were battling an enemy they couldn't even name. The notion that blood will tell took on a grim, ironic new meaning, not as a sign of inherent superiority, but often as a predictor of inherent weakness. Historians are still pondering the psychological impact of this belated scientific understanding on the last few inbred European royals. Did they grasp the biological trap their ancestors had set for them? It's a chilling thought. You've glimpsed the scientific truth that would eventually emerge. Now, let's consider the immediate, tangible legacy of weakness that royal inbreeding left behind, rippling through history. This wasn't just about individual suffering. It had profound and lasting repercussions for entire nations, impacting political landscapes and the course of empires. Imagine a game of Jenga where each removed block isn't just a piece of wood, but a vital support for a kingdom. When a monarch was physically or mentally incapacitated due to genetic issues, the real power often lay in the hands of regents, advisors, or ambitious factions at court. This created an inherent instability, a constant undercurrent of intrigue and power struggles. Decisions were delayed, policies were inconsistent, and the authority of the crown itself was diminished. You can envision the frustration of competent ministers, trying to implement grand visions while their sovereign struggled to string a coherent sentence together. This internal weakness made kingdoms vulnerable to external threats. A neighboring rival, noticing the fragility of an inbred ruler, might seize the opportunity to launch an invasion, demand territory, or simply exert greater influence. The very act of consolidating power through inbreeding often led to a paradox, a theoretically stronger bloodline that was, in practice, a gaping strategic vulnerability. It was like putting all your gold in a transparent piggy bank. Consider the impact on public perception. While the divine right of kings was a powerful concept, it was hard to maintain the mystique of a divinely chosen ruler when that ruler was visibly afflicted, frail, or mentally unfit. Whispers and discontent could easily turn into open rebellion, especially in times of hardship. A strong, charismatic leader could inspire loyalty and unite a nation, but a weak or sickly monarch could sow seeds of doubt and disunity. The ultimate price as we've discussed, was often dynastic extinction, leading to succession crises that plunged nations into devastating wars. The War of the Spanish Succession, directly linked to Charles II's infirmity and barrenness, stands as a monumental example. Entire populations suffered through decades of conflict, not for some grand ideology, but because a royal family had prioritized a misguided notion of purity over genetic health. The historical record is filled with examples of kingdoms that limped along under compromised leadership, or fractured entirely due to the internal weaknesses exacerbated by inbreeding. It's a somber testament to the fact that while ambition can build empires, biological realities can just as easily tear them down. This legacy of weakness is a powerful reminder that history is often shaped not just by grand battles and treaties, but by the unseen forces silently at work within the human body. You've considered the broader historical impact. Now, let's narrow our focus to the intimate, painful reality of the hidden sickness, chronic ailments that plagued so many inbred royals. It wasn't always a dramatic, life-threatening crisis, like hemophilia, or a glaring deformity like the Habsburg jaw. More often, it was a constant, debilitating array of chronic conditions, a never-ending cycle of discomfort, pain, and general ill-health. Imagine living in a body that constantly betrays you. You wake up with aches and pains, battle persistent digestive issues, suffer from inexplicable fevers, or endure a general sense of malaise that never quite lifts. For many inbred royals, this was their daily reality. Their compromised immune systems made them vulnerable to every passing contagion, while accumulated recessive genes contributed to a host of non-specific, yet profoundly debilitating, chronic illnesses. It was like perpetually having a bad case of the medieval sniffles. But far, far worse. These weren't necessarily conditions that would kill them outright, but they certainly diminished their quality of life and their capacity to rule effectively. How do you lead an army, attend court, or manage complex state affairs when you're constantly battling fatigue, migraines, or a chronic cough? The sheer mental and physical drain of constant illness must have been immense. It's hard enough to focus on your email inbox when you have a cold, let alone govern an entire kingdom. Think about the descriptions in historical documents. Monarchs described as frail, always ailing, suffering from melancholia, or simply weak of constitution. While some of these could be attributed to the general medical knowledge of the time or other environmental factors, the consistent pattern within heavily inbred lines points to a deeper genetic vulnerability. Their bodies, assembled from too few genetic blueprints, simply weren't as robust as those with more diverse ancestry. This perpetual state of ill health also had a knock-on effect. It limited their movements, forced them to cancel important engagements, and often left them reliant on a small circle of trusted advisors and, unfortunately, quack doctors. The very people who needed to be at the peak of their physical and mental prowess were often struggling just to get through the day. Historians continue to debate the exact nature of these chronic ailments and their precise link to inbreeding, as historical medical terminology can be ambiguous. However, the recurring theme of persistent ill health, particularly in individuals with high coefficients of inbreeding, paints a grim picture. It was a silent, agonizing burden borne by those who were supposed to be the strongest, a testament to the hidden price of a supposed pure bloodline. It's the kind of sickness that wouldn't make for a dramatic battle scene, but was far more insidious, slowly, painfully eroding life itself. You've imagined the hidden suffering, Now let's consider how this grim reality seeped into the public consciousness, sometimes subtly, sometimes glaringly, through artistic depictions, unflattering portraits. Imagine sitting for your royal portrait, a moment meant to capture your majesty and power for all eternity. But what if the very features meant to convey your noble lineage were, in reality, a testament to generations of genetic missteps? For medieval and early modern artists, depicting royalty was a delicate dance. They were commissioned to present the monarch in the best possible light, emphasizing their power, grace, and divine right. Yet, they were also bound by the expectation to capture a likeness. And sometimes, that likeness revealed a truth that was hard to sugarcoat. The physical manifestations of inbreeding, the prognathism of the Habsburgs, the less defined, more generalized facial asymmetries, the pallor, or the weary expression that constant illness could etch onto a face were often subtly, or not so subtly, present in these official portraits. Think of those Habsburg portraits again. While artists might soften the lines or strategically angle the face, that distinctive, often elongated lower jaw and prominent lip were undeniably there. It became a recognized, if unspoken, feature of the dynasty. It wasn't just artistic interpretation. It was a physical reality they couldn't entirely erase. You might try to hide a limp, but it's much harder to hide your chin. These portraits serve as fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, historical documents. They offer visual evidence of the physical toll of inbreeding, showing how pervasive these traits could become within a family line. While no artist would dare paint a king as explicitly deformed or idiotic, the subtle exaggerations, or even simply the accurate rendering of distinct features, spoke volumes to those who knew what to look for. It was like a very slow, very public, genetic billboard, and it wasn't just the jaw. Sometimes you see eyes that seem a little too far apart, or a facial structure that just looks off, even by the beauty standards of the time. These slight deviations, when consistently present across multiple generations of a family, start to tell a story that goes beyond mere individual appearance. It hints at a deeper, underlying genetic pattern. While historians are still debating the exact degree to which artists consciously emphasized these features versus simply rendering what they saw, the visual legacy is undeniable. These portraits are not just pretty pictures. They are silent witnesses to the biological consequences of dynastic ambition, offering a very public, if often unspoken, commentary on the dark truths of royal bloodlines. They remind you that even behind the most regal facade, biology always finds a way to leave its mark. You've seen the physical expressions of inbreeding in art. Now, let's consider the very spaces where these individuals lived, royal courts, which were effectively breeding grounds for disease. It wasn't just about genetic predispositions. It was about the unfortunate confluence of their weakened biological state and the realities of medieval communal living. Imagine a grand palace, seemingly opulent and pristine, but scratch beneath the surface, and you find a hive of activity, often with questionable sanitation. Crowds of courtiers, servants, advisors, and supplicants thronged the halls. While these palaces were certainly more comfortable than a peasant's hovel, they were still ripe environments for the transmission of illnesses. Now, layer that reality onto individuals who, due to generations of inbreeding, often possessed compromised immune systems and a general lack of physical robustness. It's a recipe for frequent, severe illness. Think of it like this. A normal person might catch a common cold and shake it off in a few days. For an inbred royal, that same cold could escalate into a dangerous chest infection, a lingering fever, or trigger other chronic conditions they were already battling. Their bodies simply weren't as equipped to fight off even minor pathogens. It was a vicious cycle. Weakened by genetics, they were more susceptible to disease, and each bout of illness further weakened them, making them even more vulnerable. The royal diet, while rich, was often lacking in essential nutrients by modern standards, and medieval medical practices were, shall we say, less than ideal. You might remember the Victorian women using cloth rags for menstruation. While unrelated to illness, it's another reminder of the less than hygienic realities of the past. Combine these factors with a compromised immune system, and you have a perfect storm for chronic ill health and premature death. It wasn't always a dramatic poisoning or a battle wound. Often, it was the cumulative effect of countless seemingly minor ailments that slowly wore them down. These courts, ironically, were also the centers of intellectual and political life, places where crucial decisions were made. But imagine the statecraft happening when the king or queen was constantly confined to bed, or when council meetings were interrupted by fits of coughing or periods of extreme fatigue. The daily operations of a kingdom could be severely hampered by the constant health struggles of its rulers. While historians are still piecing together the full picture of royal health and the exact impact of environmental factors versus genetic ones, the consistent pattern of frailty and chronic illness within heavily inbred royal families points to their palaces being unwitting laboratories for disease. It was a grim reality, a life of constant battle against an unseen enemy within their very cells, exacerbated by the world they inhabited. You've considered the environments and the physical tolls. Now let's confront the unseen cost: human suffering. This isn't just a historical anecdote about power struggles and odd-looking monarchs. At its heart, royal inbreeding was a profound human tragedy impacting individuals who, despite their immense privilege, often lived lives marred by pain, disability, and a gnawing sense of inadequacy. Imagine being born into a world where everything is handed to you: wealth, power, a kingdom, yet your own body is a constant source of torment. You might be unable to walk properly, or your speech is slurred and unintelligible. You might experience chronic pain, constant infections, or suffer from intellectual impairments that leave you isolated and unable to fully grasp the world around you. This wasn't just abstract genetic risk. This was deeply personal, agonizing reality for many. Think of the children. So many royal children, particularly within these inbred lines, died in infancy or early childhood. While infant mortality was high across the board in medieval times, the sheer number of lost heirs in some dynasties points to more than just bad luck. Each death was a parental heartbreak, a family grieving for a child who never got to live a full life, compounded by the political anxiety of a dwindling succession. You might be reminded of the responsibility of both parents in raising children. In Mongol culture, for royals, the responsibility was often to produce a healthy child, a burden that inbred lines found increasingly difficult to bear, and for those who survived into adulthood, the suffering often continued. Imagine the frustration of a ruler who understood their duties but lacked the physical or mental capacity to perform them. The isolation that must have accompanied such conditions, even within a bustling court, could be profound. While commoners might have faced their own hardships, they weren't under the constant scrutiny of a court, where every physical imperfection or mental lapse could be interpreted as a sign of weakness or divine displeasure. This profound personal suffering is the dark underbelly of the grand narrative of power and consolidation. It reminds you that behind every title, every crown, there was a human being trapped by the genetic choices of their ancestors. Their lives were often a testament to resilience in the face of immense biological challenges, but also a poignant reminder of the price paid for dynastic ambition. Scholars continually debate the extent to which these individuals were aware of the cause of their suffering, or if they simply accepted it as a cruel twist of fate or divine will. Regardless, their pain was real, a hidden, often unspoken cost that underscores the true human tragedy of medieval royal inbreeding. It's a somber note, a quiet whisper in the halls of history, reminding you of the lives that were lived and often cut short by this silent, insidious inheritance. You felt the weight of individual suffering. Now, let's pivot to the desperate, overarching concern that consumed royal families: the quest for a healthy heir. Imagine the immense pressure, not just from the kingdom, but from within the family itself, to produce a viable successor. For dynasties entangled in the web of inbreeding, this wasn't just a hope. It was often a terrifying, all-consuming obsession, a roll of the dice with the very future of their line at stake. The primary purpose of many royal marriages was precisely this: to produce an heir. A male heir, specifically, was the gold standard, ensuring the direct continuation of the paternal line and avoiding messy succession disputes. When a queen consistently produced only daughters, or worse, suffered repeated miscarriages and stillbirths, the anxiety within the court would reach fever pitch. Every pregnancy became a matter of national importance, whispered about in hushed tones, the gender and health of the unborn child dominating prayers and political discussions alike. For families already compromised by generations of inbreeding, this quest was particularly fraught. They knew, perhaps not scientifically, but through bitter experience, that their children were often frail or sickly. The birth of a healthy, robust child would be met with immense relief and celebration, seen almost as a miracle, a sign of divine favor. Conversely, the birth of a visibly afflicted child, or one who quickly succumbed to illness, would send shockwaves of despair and fear through the court. It was a constant reminder of the biological lottery they were playing. Think of the lengths they would go to: prayers, pilgrimages, reliance on dubious medical advice, even superstitious rituals, anything to try and coax a healthy future from a genetically precarious present. The pressure on the royal couple, especially the queen, was immense. Her body was, in effect, a vessel for the continuation of the dynasty, and any failure to produce a viable heir was seen as a personal and dynastic catastrophe. This desperate search often led to even more pragmatic, sometimes ruthless, decisions. If a first marriage proved barren or produced only sickly children, a second, third, or even fourth marriage might be arranged, sometimes with increasingly desperate choices of partners, further entangling the already complex family tree. The drive for a healthy heir superseded personal feelings, affections, or even what might be considered common decency. It was a stark example of how dynastic survival trumped almost everything else. Historians continually examine how these personal struggles with fertility and health impacted royal decision-making, influencing alliances, wars, and internal politics. The fundamental need for a healthy heir was a driving force behind countless actions in medieval courts, a chilling testament to the profound vulnerability that lay beneath the gilded facade of power. It's a reminder that even the most powerful, Families were ultimately subject to the whims of biology. You've just explored the desperate quest for a healthy heir. Now, let's consider the larger framework within which these unions occurred. You might envision royal weddings as grand, romantic affairs, but the truth is, political marriages were almost entirely devoid of love. They were cold, calculating arrangements, intricate negotiations driven by power, land, and alliances, with personal affection often being an afterthought if it was considered at all. Imagine being a young prince or princess raised with the absolute certainty that your future spouse would be chosen for you, not by you. Your personal feelings, your preferences, or even whether you found your intended appealing were utterly irrelevant. The decision rested solely with your parents and their advisors, poring over maps, treasury accounts, and diplomatic treaties. Your marriage was a contract, a bond between nations or powerful families, not between two individuals. It was like being a very expensive, living chess piece. These unions were meticulously planned, sometimes years in advance, to achieve specific strategic goals. A marriage could secure a valuable port, prevent a border war, or solidify a shaky alliance against a common enemy. The bride was often a dowry, bringing land, wealth, or influence to her new husband's family. The groom might offer military protection or a powerful lineage to elevate his bride's status. It was a transaction, pure and simple, and any genuine affection that might develop after the fact was a fortunate, but entirely coincidental, bonus. You might recall how ancient Egyptian weddings focused on establishing a stable household, similarly emphasizing practicality over romance. This lack of personal agency in marriage was particularly pronounced for royal women. Their primary role was often to be a vessel for heirs, and a pawn in the dynastic game. They were sent to foreign courts, often with no knowledge of the language or customs, expected to adapt, produce children, and solidify alliances, regardless of who their husband was. If he was kind, that was a stroke of luck. If he was cruel or physically repellent, that was simply part of the deal. The constant intermarriage among closely related royal families only amplified this detachment from affection. When your choice of spouse is limited to a handful of cousins, you're certainly not picking from a wide dating pool based on compatibility. You're simply fulfilling a dynastic obligation, often to someone you've known since childhood, who might also exhibit some of the family's more unfortunate genetic traits. Historians sometimes debate whether genuine affection could blossom in these arranged marriages. While some rare instances of royal couples finding love are documented, they were exceptions, not the rule. The overwhelming evidence points to marriages as political tools, pragmatic necessities for the continuation of power, demonstrating a stark reality in the world of medieval royalty. Love was a luxury few could afford, and certainly not a prerequisite for tying the knot. You've just peered into the emotionally detached reality of royal marriages. Now let's consider the individuals caught in the impossible position of trying to mend what was often biologically broken, the doctor's dilemma with royal health. Imagine being a court physician tasked with keeping the king, queen, or their precious heirs alive and healthy. It was a job filled with immense pressure, high stakes, and, crucially, a profound lack of understanding about the true root cause of so much royal suffering. In the medieval and early modern periods, medical knowledge was, by modern standards, rudimentary. They understood symptoms, fevers, swellings, coughs, weakness, but the concept of genetics, of inherited diseases caused by faulty genes, was entirely unknown. So, when a royal child was born sickly, or a monarch was plagued by chronic ailments like the notorious Habsburg jaw, the physicians were utterly baffled as to the underlying reason. They were treating the leaves of a poisoned tree, never understanding that the roots themselves were rotten. Think of the cures they might have prescribed: bloodletting, herbal concoctions, strange elixirs, or even prayers and religious relics. They would meticulously observe symptoms, consult ancient texts, and apply the best or worst practices of their time. But how do you cure hemophilia when you don't even know what blood clotting is? How do you strengthen a constitution weakened by generations of inbreeding when you believe humors are out of balance? It was a monumental task, often leading to frustration and, inevitably, failure. The pressure on these doctors was immense. Their very lives could depend on the health of their royal patient. If a monarch died unexpectedly, or an heir failed to thrive, the physician could face disgrace, imprisonment, or even execution, accused of incompetence or, worse, treachery. This often led to an abundance of caution, a reluctance to try anything too radical, and a reliance on traditional, often ineffective, treatments. These royal physicians were essentially flying blind, trying to fix profound biological issues with superficial remedies. They diligently recorded symptoms and observations, providing invaluable, if unwitting, data for future historians and You can almost hear their sighs of exasperation as they tried yet another poultice or administered another dubious potion, all while the king's jaw continued to protrude in his mind, continued to wander. Historians still debate the true capabilities of medieval physicians and their diagnostic acumen. However, the inherent limitation of not understanding genetics meant that for centuries, these dedicated, if misguided, medical professionals were fighting a battle they could never truly win. It's a sobering thought. The vast resources of a kingdom channeled into the best available medical care, powerless against the silent, invisible legacy of inherited traits. You've just witnessed the futile efforts of medieval doctors. Now, let's explore a curious phenomenon amidst all this genetic peril: the survival of the fittest or luckiest. Despite the overwhelming odds, the reduced fertility, and the chronic illnesses, some royal lines, even those deep in the throes of inbreeding, managed to persist. How did they do it? Often, it came down to a fascinating mix of sheer resilience and, frankly, dumb luck. Imagine a heavily inbred royal couple. Statistically, their chances of producing a healthy, fertile heir are significantly diminished. Yet, every now and then, against all biological expectations, they might produce a child who somehow escapes the worst of the genetic lottery. Perhaps they inherited a particularly fortunate combination of genes, or perhaps a harmful recessive gene simply didn't express itself in their generation, only to reappear later. It was a statistical anomaly, a roll of the genetic dice that landed favorably. These lucky individuals became the crucial links in their dynastic chain. They were the ones who managed to live long enough, reproduce successfully, and produce children who, in turn, were also relatively robust. Their existence allowed a heavily compromised line to continue for another generation, sometimes even for several more, defying the biological clock that was ticking louder for their relatives. It's like finding a perfectly intact, sparkling pearl in an oyster bed that's otherwise full of broken shells. Sometimes, this luck was amplified by pragmatic choices, perhaps born of desperation. A royal family facing imminent extinction might finally be forced to look outside their tightly knit, inbred circle for a spouse, marrying a more distant relative, or even someone from a completely unrelated noble house. Gasp. could introduce much-needed genetic diversity, essentially diluting the harmful recessive genes that had accumulated over centuries. This infusion of fresh blood could act like a genetic reset, giving the dynasty a new lease on life, even if it meant sacrificing some of that cherished purity. Consider the sheer determination. To many of these monarchs, even those battling chronic illness, exhibited incredible resolve. They pushed through their physical limitations, driven by the immense pressure to rule and secure their lineage. Their survival wasn't just biological. It was often a testament to sheer willpower in the face of debilitating conditions. While many dynasties succumbed to the consequences of inbreeding, the persistence of others highlights the complex interplay of genetics, environment, and pure chance. The fact that some lines manage to cling on, sometimes for centuries, despite clearly visible signs of decline, is a testament to the unpredictable nature of biology and the occasional triumph of fortune over overwhelming odds. It's a reminder that even in the darkest genetic narratives, there could be unexpected glimmers of survival. You've seen the historical struggles. Now, let's fast forward to the present day and observe modern royalty breaking the cycle. Imagine glancing at today's European monarchies, the Windsors of the United Kingdom, the House of Orange-Nassau in the Netherlands, the Bernadottes in Sweden. What do you notice? A striking absence of the prominent Habsburg jaw, a lack of widespread hemophilia, and generally, a vibrant picture of health and vitality. This isn't accidental. It's a deliberate and profound shift from the medieval practices we've been discussing. Modern royal families have overwhelmingly abandoned the practice of close-kin marriage. The reasons are multifold, but chief among them is the scientific understanding of genetics that emerged from the 20th century, with knowledge of recessive genes and the heightened risks of genetic disorders. The idea of marrying a first cousin for dynastic purity simply became unthinkable, a dangerous relic of a bygone era. You would unknowingly play Russian roulette with your children's health, and neither do modern royals. The motivations for marriage have also fundamentally changed. While political considerations still play a minor role, modern royal marriages are far more often about genuine affection, shared interests, and finding a compatible partner. Royal individuals now typically choose spouses from a much broader pool, often marrying commoners or members of less exalted but genetically diverse, noble families from across the globe. This infusion of new genetic material is precisely what prevents the accumulation of harmful recessive genes and ensures a much healthier future for their descendants. Think of Prince William marrying Kate Middleton, a commoner, or the countless other examples of European royals marrying individuals without a drop of blue blood. These unions would have been scandalous, almost treasonous, in the medieval period, utterly unthinkable for maintaining a pure bloodline. Today, they are celebrated as signs of modernity and a healthier approach to dynastic continuation. It's a stark contrast to the anxieties and fears surrounding Roman marriage, where the wedding night was fraught with uncertainty for the woman. For modern royal women, while still under scrutiny, the genetic stakes are thankfully much lower. The result is evident. Modern royal families are generally robust, healthy, and enjoy longer lifespans, much like the general population, while they still face the usual human ailments. The specific genetic scourges that haunted their medieval ancestors are largely absent. It's a testament to the power of scientific knowledge and a collective societal evolution. The pursuit of pure bloodlines has given way to the pursuit of healthy bloodlines, acknowledging that true strength lies in diversity, not in constriction. You've seen the healthy evolution of modern royalty. Now, let's bring it back to a deeper reflection. The ethical echoes of our genetic responsibility. What the medieval royals did, unknowingly playing genetic roulette, serves as a powerful, albeit tragic, cautionary tale for us today. It prompts us to consider the profound ethical implications of genetic choices and their potential impact on future generations, even in our own lives. Imagine, for a moment, the immense power and responsibility that comes with having knowledge of genetics. We live in an era where genetic testing can identify predispositions to certain diseases, where IVF can help select embryos free of known genetic disorders, and where gene editing is no longer purely science fiction. This power carries with it a significant ethical weight, a responsibility to use it wisely, and to learn from the mistakes of the past. The story of royal inbreeding serves as a stark reminder of the long-term, unforeseen consequences of limiting genetic diversity. While most of us aren't contemplating marrying our first cousins for dynastic gain, the principle remains. Genetic health thrives on variety. It's a basic biological truth that applies to all species, including humans. When gene pools become too shallow, vulnerabilities emerge, silently accumulating until they manifest in ways that can be devastating. Think about the wider implications. While the extreme cases of royal inbreeding are historical anomalies, the principles they illustrate are universal. They highlight the importance of genetic counseling for couples who might be unknowingly related, or who come from populations with higher incidences of certain recessive disorders. They underscore the value of understanding family medical histories, not just out of curiosity, but out of a sense of responsibility for future generations. The past's dark truths illuminate our present ethical landscape. They compel us to ask, what responsibility do we have to the genetic well-being of our descendants? How do we balance personal choice with the broader implications of our reproductive decisions? These are complex questions, certainly not easy to answer, but ones that the history of royal inbreeding brings into sharp focus. There's a silent, almost whispering voice from those long-dead monarchs and their sickly children, reminding us of the invisible threads that connect us to our ancestors and bind us to our future. It's a powerful testament to the idea that our choices, particularly those related to our biology, can have profound ripple effects that extend far beyond our own lifespans. We are, in a very real sense, the custodians of our future gene pool. You've reflected on our modern genetic responsibility. Now, let's distill the profound lessons from the past. Genetics warning. The entire grim narrative of medieval royal inbreeding, from the ambition that fueled it to the suffering it caused, serves as a monumental real-world case study in the immutable laws of biology. It's a loud, clear warning etched into the annals of history, a permanent testament to the dangers of ignoring fundamental genetic principles. Imagine the countless lives lived in pain, the thrones left vacant, the wars fought, all because powerful individuals clung to a flawed understanding of bloodlines and purity. The core lesson is brutally simple. Limiting genetic diversity has dire consequences. When you restrict the flow of new genes into a population, you inevitably increase the likelihood of harmful recessive traits emerging. It's a biological inevitability, as relentless and unforgiving as gravity. This isn't just a quaint historical curiosity. The mechanisms that caused the Habsburg jaw or spread hemophilia are still at play today, affecting human populations and even animal breeding programs. The historical example of royal inbreeding offers a stark, macroscopic view of these principles in action, writ large across the political map of Europe. It's a compelling argument against the very notion of rigid pure lines, whether in royalty or any other context. The story also reminds us of the profound irony inherent in human ambition. In their desperate quest to consolidate power and ensure dynastic survival, these monarchs unwittingly sowed the seeds of their own destruction. The very solution they embraced became the problem, a classic example of unintended consequences playing out on a grand, generational scale. They sought strength, but cultivated weakness. They sought stability, but invited chaos. Furthermore, it highlights the importance of scientific literacy. Had the medieval world possessed even a rudimentary understanding of genetics, centuries of suffering and dynastic decline might have been averted. It underscores the value of knowledge, of empirical observation, and of listening to the quiet truths of the natural world, even when they conflict with cherished beliefs or powerful ambitions. The ultimate warning from this dark chapter of history is simple. Biology bats last. No amount of political power, no amount of wealth, and no amount of perceived divine right can override the fundamental laws of inheritance. The consequences of genetic choices, whether deliberate or unwitting, will always, eventually, make themselves known. It's a sobering thought, a silent whisper from the past, urging us to learn from their costly mistakes. You've heard the stark warnings from the past. Now, as our journey through the dark truths of medieval royal inbreeding comes to a close, let's reflect on these stories as a closing thought, a distant mirror. This wasn't just a tale of kings and queens, their peculiar habits, or their unfortunate ailments. It's a profound human story, one that echoes with universal lessons about ambition, vulnerability, and the enduring power of biological realities. Imagine those dimly lit castle halls again, the whispered conspiracies, the desperate prayers for an heir, the quiet suffering behind opulent facades. These are not just figures in dusty history books. They were real people, caught in a system that prioritized lineage above all else, often condemning them to lives of fragility and pain. Their choices, born of a different era and different knowledge, created a legacy that, ironically, undermined the very power they sought to protect. Think of the anxieties and fears surrounding Roman marriage you learned about earlier, the uncertainties faced by women. While the context is different, that underlying human vulnerability, the hope and uncertainty of creating a family, resonates through time. The royals, despite their immense power, faced their own unique forms of dread, often far more pervasive and insidious, rooted in their very genetic makeup. This historical journey serves as a powerful reminder of how deeply interconnected we are across generations. Our ancestors' choices, their environments, and their biological realities, whether good or bad, shape who we are today. Similarly, the choices we make today, particularly those concerning health and genetics, will ripple forward, influencing the lives of our descendants in ways we can barely comprehend. So, as you drift off tonight, let the echoes of these ancient courts fade gently. Remember that true strength, whether for a kingdom or an individual, often lies not in rigid adherence to artificial purity, but in the beautiful, chaotic, and ultimately resilient power of diversity. The royal families of old learned this lesson the hard way, leaving us a legacy of warning that is both chilling and profoundly insightful. The whispers of the past tell us that understanding ourselves, our biology, and our shared human condition is perhaps the greatest wisdom of all. Sweet dreams.